I bought a house for $1 and learned the hard way that some people will try to turn your whole life into their investment. The first time I saw the place, it smelled like old wood and rain and the kind of silence that makes you lean in like a secret waiting for someone to admit it. If I had known what would come after that deed was signed, I might have kept my hands in my pockets and stayed quiet. But then I wouldn't have a story to tell you. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm not a lawyer or a developer. I'm just a guy who used to fix traction motors and change tires and who, after losing Maya, wanted something to put my hands on besides grief. Maya liked old things the way a chipped teacup seemed to hold the person who'd used it, the little histories in windowsills. When she died, I kept finding her notes in the glove compartment and in a shoebox of postcards, and the idea of bringing something back to life felt like a way to keep her breath in the world. That's how I ended up at the Heartfelt auction, on a wet Tuesday, handing over $1 and a stamped piece of paper that said I was now the owner of a sagging house on the edge of town. The house, I call it the Marlowe house, stood on a half-acre, 2 stories of sagging rooflines, and a porch that hung like a tired smile. It had a history, of course. Every room had layers wallpaper over wallpaper, a ledger nailed behind a bathroom mirror, a brass key in a seam where the floorboards met. The county sold it for $1 because the taxes were a decade in arrears, and because the developer who'd owned the surrounding land had gone bankrupt. I saw the bones and the possibility, and for some reason it felt less like a gamble and more like homecoming. At first, everything was smaller than my worry. Getting the roof patched, the interviews at the local recycling center where I bargained for reclaimed banisters, late nights with a flashlight as I cataloged nails and old letters. Neighbors brought casseroles, the ones who didn't glare at me when the work trucks came, and the local hardware store let me put my name on a tab. There was a rhythm to fixing something that was broken. It soothed the parts of me that had nothing to do except miss her. People started saying things like, "You're doing right by it." And that felt better than any check I could write. I suppose that's when Lydia Pembroke noticed. Lydia is the kind of person who has a 30-year tan and a whisper that spreads faster than a rumor. She's the president of the Heartfelt Homeowners Collective. The word association sounds cleaner, but collective was their preference. The group that runs social barbecues, enforces rules about paint colors, and, as I learned, keeps a ledger of grudges. Lydia came to the porch in a white SUV with chrome like a mirror. She wore a cream blouse and a pearl necklace and an expression that said she'd been the person in charge of the town since before I was born. She measured me with a look and then measured the house the same way, the kind of look that sizes up interest and threat in the same blink. "You know there are covenants," she said, leaning on the railing as if she owned it. She pronounced covenants like it was a hymn. "Historic preservation. Setbacks. Community standards." "I do," I said because I did. I'd read the stack of county filings. I'd spoken to the historian who lived 2 streets over. I'd walked the property line with the surveyor. "I'm doing everything by the book." Lydia smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Good, because we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." And that was the first misunderstanding, the one that smelled like a warning. Small, polite, coded in paperwork. A week later, a cease and desist notice appeared on my front door like a pale moth. It said my work had to stop immediately. I called her office, and they said it must have been a clerical error. A month later, someone cut power to my temporary breaker box. Then there were letters, complaints about paint color, the unauthorized removal of original fixtures, a whispered accusation that I disturbed something archaeologically significant in the garden. Every complaint had a signature I didn't recognize, or someone who claimed they remembered the house differently. I had no patience for small-town politics at first. I thought it was a spat. Someone likes a porch swing, and someone else wants a different porch swing. But there's a scale to malice, and Lydia had turned hers into a machine. She leaned on the collective like a timber/rudder and pulled together people who were tired of new things, who saw in my restoration an affront, either to their idea of the neighborhood or to an opportunity to make a buck. She didn't just want the house kept the way it was. She wanted it cleared. There were whispers about a development proposal, a strip of condos and townhomes that would make certain people rich, and the Marlowe house sat smack in the shape of where those townhomes would go. You learn to read people when you've read deeds and wills and tax documents for a living. There are tells. Lydia's son, Martin, had the tell of somebody who'd been told where the money would be and didn't mind being the muscle. He'd come around with a smile and a jaw like a plank. When the dispute started to thicken, Martin and a couple of men he'd recruited began showing up at odd times, checking the perimeter, which is how I learned that you can be intimidated without a single raised fist. People in pickup trucks go slow past your house, take pictures, ask questions in a voice that's just loud enough to be a threat. The thing about a person like Lydia is she understands institutions. She knows how to make the system do the heavy lifting for her. One afternoon, I found a stack of filings at the county office that suddenly made sense in the worst way. Deeds with marginal notes, affidavits that had been typed and notarized, signatures that matched, or almost matched, the names of people long dead. She had resources, or people who were willing to fake them. There were boundary claims and adverse possession filings. They tried to argue that the land beneath my porch had been used by the collective for decades, and therefore belonged to them. The logic was a contortion, lies wrapped in legal language. I hired Rita Ellis, who is a lawyer with a reputation for doing the obsessive kind of work that wins cases. Rita is small and fierce. She smiles like a threat and reads documents like scripture. If you ever meet someone who looks at a county ledger and gets a gleam, that's Rita. She pulled up old plats. She went to the state archives for microfilm. She called the people who remembered who'd lived where and why. We found a faded typed covenant from 1890 that protected the house, an old preservation trust that made it illegal to demolish or materially alter the structure without approval from the State Historic Office. It wasn't a silver bullet, but it was a rope to hold on to when everything else tried to push me into the dark. By then, Lydia had moved from paperwork to people. There was an evening when I came back and found the garden gate cut and a note pinned to a post. Do what's right for the neighborhood. It read like a threat and a sermon. Shortly after that, someone slashed the tires on my work truck. I slept with a baseball bat by my bed. I'm not proud of the way it hardened me how my hands started looking for threats where there weren't any, but when you have something you're trying to build back from, and someone keeps trying to erase it, you learn to watch. There was a night, the one that sits in my head like a fulcrum, when things went farther than graffiti and broken glass. I drove home late, headlights painting the long road, and saw a silhouette standing on my porch. Someone was leaning over the front steps like they had the right. I started to get out of the truck when Martin's voice called out, "Hey Ethan, thought you left." He stepped into the light, and he had something at his hip, a pistol, small and ugly in the way those things are. Martin spoke like somebody reading a line he'd been given from a play he'd never auditioned for. "You should think about selling," he said. "Wouldn't be good to see your tools taken." There's a moment in those scenes where time compresses. I remember the way the porch light flared, the creak of the swing, the pattern of rain on the stoop. I remember thinking, oddly, whether a man can smell fear, whether fear has a scent. You learn something about yourself when you stay and talk, and the conversation is about who gets to stay on a rectangle of land. I kept my voice steady. "You don't scare me," I said, because I thought showing courage would make him come closer. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. Martin laughed. He didn't have the patience for courage, and after a few seconds he turned and walked back toward his truck. He left the pistol on the porch railing. By the time I went to get it, not to take it, because that would be stupid, but to know the truth of what had been there, Lydia's car was gone. I called Rita. We reported it. We filed police reports. The cops came and wrote things down on a pad and said they'd patrol more. The patrols were polite and temporary. In small towns, problems are often short-term because people get tired. That kind of tiredness was the advantage Lydia had. She could outlast other people if she let the machinery tick. That machinery is terrifyingly efficient when it's used right. Lydia started a whisper campaign that twisted neighbors' memories into legal statements. "I remember the Marlowe used to have a garden club," one affidavit said. "My family used to path through that lot for 50 years, claimed another. There were photos that showed the house in different seasons and different ownership, and a forger with a practiced hand began weaving stories into documents. Once you let someone rewrite the past, especially with signatures and stamps, you can make the present feel like an error." Rita, bless her, pushed back. She subpoenaed records. She brought in handwriting experts. She dug through tax rolls until her eyes watered. We found a ledger in the state archives, a ledger that had been tucked between two larger volumes like a secret, that showed the Marlowe house had been part of an 1890 trust specifically held to prevent development. The trust required preservation and forbade sale to developers looking to subdivide. It was the kind of paper that can unmake a terrible plan if you can get it in front of the right judge. But evidence is not a story until someone tells it correctly, and Lydia had already taken to the cameras. She was slick. She'd had the collective's little newsletter turn the story into gossip. She hired a contractor with a flashy van who claimed the house was a hazard to children because of lead paint. She hired, secretly, a man who'd been in minor trouble before to make observations. He left piles of debris and spoke to a council member about safety concerns. He threatened to call environmental inspectors. And somewhere along the way, someone, maybe Lydia, maybe not, paid some guy to come to my mailbox and tell me that if I didn't sell, he'd make things happen. You feel small in those moments. You ask yourself whether standing up is worth it, whether the weight of a legal battle will crush you. I won't lie. I considered leaving. There were dark nights where I imagined packing the truck, walking away with a duffel bag of memories. It would have been easier, and sometimes I catch myself thinking about what might have been different if I had. But then I'd see the reclamation of the staircase, the way the morning light cut through a newly repaired window like a blade, and something stubborn in me would say, not yet. The turning point came in the kind of place you'd expect, not a courtroom, but the little coffee shop in town where people talk too loud and secrets get loose. Emma Roswell, an archivist, and one of the few people who'd taken a genuine interest in preserving our small town's history, brought an envelope and a photograph to my table. She'd been researching the old trustee committee records and found a notation, a legal margin note, that referenced a federal grant for preservation tied to the property. "This," she said, tapping the paper, "isn't just a county agreement. This ties to a state historic preservation act. This could escalate it beyond your average HOA squabble." Rita took that on like a dog with a bone. She explained that if the state or federal preservation office recognized the covenant, any attempt to forcibly take or demolish the house could attract federal attention. That's not a small thing when you're up against people who think the law is something to be reshaped. It meant there was a line Lydia could not cross without bringing a level of scrutiny she clearly did not want. It also meant that if Lydia tried to manufacture more evidence or intimidate people into signing false affidavits, the pattern would be so obvious that even the town grapevine couldn't hide it. Of course, Lydia didn't stop. People like her don't usually back off when they're close. Instead, she grew more creative. There was a night one I replay over and over because it felt like a scene out of a cheap crime movie when someone broke into the Marlowe house with the intent to take documents. They were clumsy, and there were door ciphers and a motion detector that Rita insisted on. The alarms screamed, blue lights blinked, and the intruders fled with one box missing because the motion sensor had sent an alert fast enough. We got the security footage, and it showed Martin, not very gracefully trying to clip a file and run. That footage was a gift and a dagger. It proved intent, and it made the collateral damage palpable. These were not idle threats, they were actions. We took it to the local press. For a week the story was small, the kind of thing the paper runs between the high school football scores and a letter about stray cats, but the ripple grew. Someone at the state historic office happened to be reading the same paper when their coffee spilled and their fingers snagged the story. Then a call came that changed the math. The State Historic Preservation Office opened an inquiry. It's surreal, the way a small town becomes the stage for larger forces. Suddenly Lydia's careful scaffolding of influence was threatened by people who'd been trained to look for patterns and evidence beyond a rumor mill. The grand showdown was the kind of day every small town is oddly built for. A public meeting in the municipal hall, chairs lined like pews, local reporters with notepads, neighbors in coats. Lydia arrived with a show. She'd rallied a group of supporters and hired a pair of consultants who looked like they stepped out of a development brochure. She had an urn of petitions and a folder of affidavits and a smile that had been practiced in mirrors. I showed up with Rita and Emma and a folder that smelled like old paper because for weeks we'd been pulling documents from archives and scanning microfilm and coaxing facts into the light. Rita stood up and said things that made sense in the way of law, clear, patient descriptions of chain of title and trust clauses. She read from the 1890 trust. She read the margin notes about preservation and, finally, the State Historic Office's preliminary findings. Lydia countered with passion and insistence and the kind of moral outrage that people with power can perform very convincingly. But then Rita put the security footage on the screen. Martin's face was there, clumsy and surprised. The man who'd claimed he'd never been on the property had a van with a bumper sticker that matched a photo taken a week earlier in Lydia's company. It's a strange thing to watch someone unspool in public. Lydia's colors, the cool pearls, and the measured voice slipped into something raw. She tried to call a recess, to reframe things, but the state officer's representative stood up and asked to review the evidence. That's when 3 uniformed officers arrived, not the sheriff, but the state investigator, and asked Lydia some very plain questions about who had hired the men caught on the tape. No one likes being asked questions they can't answer. The rest of it collapsed in the way bad plans do when enough light falls on them. There were arrests, not cinematic in a Hollywood way, but the real kind where people are led away with expressions that are a mixture of shock and annoyance. Lydia swore she was being targeted. Some neighbors cheered. Some looked away. I remember standing outside afterward, the Marlowe house behind me, lights on in the windows like a heartbeat, and feeling a wash of something I couldn't name. Relief, mostly, but also exhaustion. The town would not be entirely undone by this. People would gossip and take sides, and months from now someone would still say, well, maybe Ethan was lucky. Lucky felt like a sliver. What we had done was messy, and it required stubbornness and proof and allies who don't give up. I could tell you there was a neat legal victory and then a tidy montage of restoration, and there was some of that. Permits granted, grants applied for, a small lean team that came in to help repair the plaster, a neighbor who had an old picture of the original porch rail that allowed the carpenters to rebuild it to match. We held a small open house the spring after the hearing, nothing huge, just coffee and people who had helped. We put out a sign that said, Marlowe House Restored, and took a picture for the paper. Rita got a small smile in the corner, as if this had been another good day at the office. But endings aren't neat. Lydia's story didn't end with a jail cell and a movie montage. It spread into appeals and allegations and a lawsuit that lingered like smoke. Some neighbors changed their minds, some didn't. The development plan stalled because of the scrutiny, but the notion of profit didn't die. It slunk off and waited, like a predator that had been forced to find another path. Martin lashed out in town, and I heard his voice in the grocery line. But he kept his distance, perhaps because scrutiny had made proximity costly. And me, I learned the ways systems work, the soft grinding of committees, the subtle sway of petitions, the way a small stack of paper can be a fortress or a weapon. I learned that grief can be a quiet fuel, and that building something with your hands is a kind of prayer. I learned, too, that neighbors matter, and that the person who brings you a casserole when the nights are cold might be the same person you need in court. The Marlowe house now stands more solid than it did when I first bought it for $1. The plaster is patched, the porch swing hangs level, and the windows hold the light differently. We put a small plaque by the door recognizing the Preservation Trust and the people who fought to save it. I read that plaque sometimes, like a benediction. It's not because I'm sentimental, it's because the truth matters. When the story is told right, it can stop someone else from trying the same thing. I tell you this not as a victory lap, I'm not asking you to clap, but because there's a temptation in these stories to reduce everything to black and white. It's not. Lydia had people who depended on the promise of development money in ways that looked like survival. She had earned respect in a town that rewards order. That doesn't excuse what she did, but it complicates it. It means when we debate who's right and who's wrong, we need to push against our urge for tidy verdicts and ask instead, what systems made it possible? Who benefits when small people are squeezed for big plans? So what should you take from this? Maybe nothing but a good tale to tell at a party. Maybe a reminder that property and memory are entangled, and that sometimes the bravest thing is to stay and fix. If you live in a place with an HOA, read their rules before you buy paint. If you find yourself protecting something small and sacred, gather friends early. They help in practical ways and in the quiet ways that matter. I'm telling you the truth as I saw it, messy, human, and a little bit stubborn. If you want to know whether I'd do it again, I think I would. Not because I love paperwork or conflict, but because when something holds a story, it's worth keeping. The Marlowe house holds Maya's handwriting on an old grocery list and a dent in the wood where a child once carved initials. It's not the house that matters so much as what it keeps. Memory, history, proof that someone resisted. Now tell me, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you sell and walk away? Or would you stand and fight and put up signs and call lawyers and sleep with a baseball bat by the bed? Drop a comment and tell me which side you're on, and if you've had a run-in with an HOA, tell the story below. Share this with someone who likes a good fight for the underdog. And if you stuck with me this long, subscribe for more stories like this, the ones about people who fix, who hold, who won't let history be written over by profit.